Intro. So, hey everyone, welcome to our 7th episode of WWM Marketer, a podcast that seeks to spark authentic and meaningful conversations with marketers from all around the world. Today we'll be having Sarah, the creative strategist all the way from Colorado, USA.
Hello, it's great to be here. I'm so excited to chat today. We've got like a lot of cool topics that we were talking about earlier, so I'm like, let's get into it. It's going to be so fun.
Let's get into it. Well, welcome to the pod, Sarah. So today I just wanted to get the audience to know a bit about yourself. So could you share with your audience about your journey?
Yes. Okay. So my journey is really odd. I started doing this when I was 21, 22, and I just turned 34. So like I've been doing this for a really, really long time. And I originally started out as like graphic designer, brand person. So I was doing basically just branding for a long, long time, for like 2 to 3 years. And that was an odd segue too, because I was doing it straight out of college. So I didn't actually finish college. I did probably about like 2 years. And then I think it was my sophomore year, my college professor told me, if you're good at this and you really enjoyed marketing and graphic design, you don't actually need a degree to do it. You can just go get a job and do it. And I was like, cool, I don't want to go to school anyways. So I'm going to go do that. So I dropped out of school and then just basically became a freelancer for the next like 13 years. So I was doing a ton of different things in those, like in my 20s in particular. Lots of WordPress websites, lots of like email marketing and SMS. I did like social media management. I went all over the place and did as many things as I could just because it was fun and interesting. And during that time, I had kind of a side hobby where I was constantly going to the library picking up marketing books. And next to the marketing books were like all these psychology books because they were just, that's how the Dewey Decimal System works. So while I was checking out marketing, I just kept grabbing as many psychology books as I could because it was just interesting. It was like fascinating stuff. So I read a lot about neuroscience and consumer behavior and economics and like just psychology in general. And I didn't realize that it applied really well to marketing until I was like accidentally bringing it into the marketing strategies I was producing. And then when I think I was probably around 30, I fell into paid advertising as a lead gen person, which is totally different from ecom. And from there, it was just like, it just exploded. Like I couldn't get enough of it. I love paid advertising. It's so interesting. And I, again, accidentally fell into ecom. And then after that, I just started noticing that once I started applying like the psychology that I had been studying for 10 years, it worked so incredibly well for paid advertising in particular. I had used it before for like everything else I was doing in marketing. But for paid advertising, it was just like the right match. It was like so beautiful. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since. So psychology-based paid advertising is what I do now.
Wow, that's good to hear. So speaking of which, you have been very vocal on performance creative, and that's essentially what I've been doing 24/7. And I think a lot of people, they see on Twitter, they're saying like, oh, even LinkedIn, there's like people screaming like, oh, creative is like the king or the queen right now, like headline is dead and all that. So there's a lot of buzz going on around tips and tricks on how to make performance creatives. But what are they really? I think for me as a new marketer who just started to know what performance creative is and came across the term even. So how would you explain performance creative to newbie marketers? Like what are they really? What's the difference between them and a UGC, for example?
Yeah. So performance creative in itself is built to do one thing, and that's perform. And when we say perform, we're talking strictly sales. So anytime you hear people talking about the differences between like performance creative or UGC or just straight up graphic design or social media in itself, there's a difference between organic style and paid style. So organic is anything you post to kind of any sort of social media platform that really drives forward brands. So it has a lot to do with personality. It's not really built to sell anything. It's more just built to gather more people into your ecosystem. Paid though, anytime it's going towards paid advertising, that's performance based. So the creative that you're building is specifically made to convert people to actually buy something from you. So that's the difference between the two. And that's why I think everybody's kind of talking about it a lot more nowadays is since iOS 14, that's basically all we have to work with on the paid side is the creative itself. So, yeah.
Right, I see. And for UGC, like people would say like, oh, if you just get a content creator and create it their own, and then we can use it to run ads or not. So how would the performance creator come in there, like from your side as a performance creative strategist? How does it really work? Do you create content yourself, or do you just sit down and just look at what works, what doesn't work, and then guide them instead?
Yes. So creative strategy wasn't a thing when I came into the industry like 3 or 4 years ago. especially on the lead gen side, we never even heard of creative strategy. It wasn't around. After iOS 14, I think we found that there was a huge gap between the people who knew how to build a creative, like graphic designers, copywriters, those type of people, and the people who actually ran the creative, which was media buyers, even on like marketing director kind of field, people who understood paid advertising. So we saw this gap, and it was just getting wider and wider and wider. So the creative strategist kind of came into play when we found that there was a small group of people that understood both paid side, the media buying, and the actual graphic design side. So we saw designers who were also very good at the actual metric media side, which is kind of a rare person to find because you have to be very creative and you also have to be very analytical, which doesn't happen very often. I find that most of the time people lean one way or the other. So what we were trying to do is basically align those two groups together. So as a creative strategist, it's my job to go in and build out a strategy. And most of the time I get the question of like, well, what does that mean? Strategy is such like a, I don't know, abstract word that people are like, yeah, what does that mean? Strategy. The strategy in itself is basically to answer two things. Where do we want to go and how do we get there? That's all we're trying to figure out as creative strategists. We have a lot of tools, obviously, that can help us do that. We have graphic designers, copywriters, we have UGC creators, we have influencers, we have YouTube, we have TikTok, we have Facebook. We have all these different tools that we can use to get us to somewhere. So the very first thing we have to decide is where are we going? Most of the time, this is based on what our sales goals are for that particular month and what are we trying to hit overall through the year for this particular brand. So that if this brand is trying to scale from, I don't know, 1 million up to 5 million this year or 1 million up to 10 million, that's a huge gap. We have to figure out how we're going to actually fill those numbers in and which tools we're going to use to do that. So that's currently my job. I used to be a UGC creator when that was like slowly starting to kind of rise. And I really loved it, but UGC creation is time consuming. It's it's a heavy load of work. And the UGC creators that are very good at it are super skilled and like they deserve to get paid what they're paid because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to create those. So I segued all the way over into creative strategy and like consumer behavior just because that's what I was more interested in. But yeah, it's intense being a UGC creator for sure.
Fair enough. I think personally, me as well, like when I got interested in performance creative, I tried to do a bit of UGC content creator, a creator role. I thought it was easy, but it took me like one day to just shoot one video. And I'm like, oh my God, like, how can I do it multiple videos per day? I'm like, oh, it's so tough.
Yeah, some of these people are doing it like hours on hours. This is their full-time job. And usually one ad from start to finish usually took me about 5-6 hours to build. And it was just like, this is insane.
Yes. I think especially when you're one man band and you don't have like a lot of professional equipment, just you and the lighting, like, how can I get this right?
Yes, and especially if I'm tired or like I said something wrong, then I have to take it 3 more times just to make sure it sounds right. It's just like UGC creators are awesome. You guys, shout out to the UGC creators because it's a hard job.
It is. And speaking of which, like as a performance creative strategist, like you have mentioned, is to know where and to go and how to go with it. So there's a bit of a discussion to say how professional a creative should be. Some people say that, some people coin it the ugly versus pretty ads, where pretty ads have lots of fancy equipment, ugly ads are just shot from iPhone. Which one works really? How does it really, how do you really dissect it as a creative strategist from ugly versus pretty ads?
This is a really good question. My friend Barry Hott would probably have a lot to say about this. Barry is solidly in the ugly ad camp. But I have seen really, really good results from either side. So when you hear people talk about pretty versus ugly ads, what we're really talking about is which one performs better, a branded ad that has professionally shot photography, really good copy, and like really good design, or an ad that you just kind of threw into whatever you had, Canva or Photoshop or whatever it was, and you just threw it up there and called it good. Either one, in my opinion, as long as it's performing, as long as you're getting sales off of it, consistent sales for the cheapest price is a good ad in my book. So oftentimes you'll find that when you start running ads, it's odd. Like you think that maybe the pretty ones would work best. Randomly, we will see like the ugliest ads on the planet generate the most lift for these accounts. So it's interesting. And this is the reason why the psychology piece comes into it quite often. Because in my world, I'm not looking at what the actual ad is I'm not really looking at like the branded performance of the ad. I'm more looking at what does the psychology of the ad look like? How is it
Yeah.
built? Is it reading left to right if we were looking at English speakers? Are we reading top to bottom if we're reading for a specific country that does that? Like specifically like any sort of country where you read right to left, we need to make sure the ad focuses that way on the creative side. You have to
Uh,
kind of think about who are we delivering this ad to and what are they used to seeing? Oftentimes this comes down to expectations of the consumers. And if you don't understand those expectations, it's very difficult to build a good ad. This is why oftentimes we'll see those ugly ones work because ugly stands out psychologically.
right. Is it
Very
because
interesting conversation.
is it because it kind of blends in with the organic side, so people would just be like, oh, it's just
Yeah.
another like let's say friends or family that posted it I might not know of, and compared to
Yes.
perhaps because consumers are trained to recognize the pretty ads as an ad, but the ugly ad is
Yeah.
like it's very hard to catch it. Like you still have a few seconds to
Yeah.
hook them up. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And some of this comes down to the generation of the consumer that you are targeting as well. So if you're targeting
Right.
somebody my age, 30s to 40s, which is somewhere in between like old millennials and like Gen Xers, basically, if you're targeting that particular group set, we didn't grow up with any sort of like digital native environment. We knew a time where there was no internet, right? So those particular people have a very different way of looking at the world than say like millennials, like young millennials,
Yeah.
and anybody below them, basically. So you have to take into account a lot of different things when you're starting to run paid advertising. I read a stat the other day that said somewhere between like 20 and 50% of all paid advertising like spend is wasted. So
Yes.
we're spending a lot of money to basically just like dump it in a trash can and set it on fire. So from my standpoint, I'm like, I would want to know as much as I possibly can about who we're targeting, what their life is, and what they expect from an ad if I'm going to be spending money on it. Because it's pricey to run ads nowadays. So yeah, I don't
Right.
know.
It
Ugly
is.
versus pretty. I end with psychology.
Right. Okay. I like your point of view. At the end, it's what the consumer wants as well. I think for
Exactly.
like younger generations, like people who are born like after 2000s, like they're
Yeah.
especially growing up in a digital native world.
Yeah.
Perhaps this will apply more towards the ugly ad because they are already been bombarded by so many pretty ads. I think whereas I heard from I think Dara Danny and Savannah Sanchez podcast, they talk about like
Yeah.
they target the older demographics. Like they do prefer more professional ads because it
Yep.
builds trust. But for
Yes.
the younger generation, they prefer like influencers and all that because it's what we're growing up
Exactly.
and what we are used to.
Yeah.
And that really got me thinking to say maybe it's not as easy as a fact of just team you ugly or team pretty.
Yes.
It depends.
Yes, 100%. It's not as easy as ugly or pretty. It really depends on who you're serving the ad to. Because, as you said, boomers, older generations, they're very, very much used to those ads that must look pretty because I can't build
Yeah,
trust in anything that can't afford a pretty ad.
true.
But if you're somebody my age or younger, it's kind of like, it doesn't matter if it's pretty or not, as long as like I resonate with the brand and it's entertaining. As long as you
Right, that's true.
entertain me, I'll buy whatever you have. Yeah, totally depends
That's
on the
true.
person. Mhm.
And then speaking of which, I'd like to touch more about psychology side today. I saw you have a presentation. You mentioned that a lot of the actions are done on the subconscious level and at the
Yeah.
conscious level, which is really what like it's really hard for marketers to grasp when it comes to planning. And how can we put and understand the subconscious behaviors of the consumers when it comes to planning a performance creative? Would you be able to shed some light on that?
Yeah, yeah. So this goes down into implementation, which I think almost everybody struggles with. Is it's really nice. Like we have all this data on our consumers. We know that they're boomers. She's like maybe 55. She lives with her husband. Her kids are out of her house. She has two cats. We know who we're targeting. The issue then becomes how do we build her an ad that she's going to click on? So this comes down into understanding a little bit more of like how the brain actually makes decisions. So and this is tough. There's so many different topics we could talk about, but
Right.
overall, I would say you have to understand which platform are they on because every single platform behaves in a different way, and most of the platforms attract a different crowd. So currently, there's not a lot of boomers on TikTok. It's predominantly kind of like a millennial-ish crowd and younger. It skews a little bit that way. Pinterest is another one where it's like currently there's predominantly women on there, although there's a whole lot more men coming on that app, daily. Facebook is predominantly older generations, and for the most part, like Caucasian female is what they skew. So knowing and understanding who's on the platform already and who uses it on a daily basis is helpful to understand where you should put your dollars. And then after that, we need to understand how the platforms get used. So TikTok is one that's really interesting because this platform was built to capitalize on a dopamine hit. So dopamine is not necessarily a reward receptor in the brain. It's a neurotransmitter that's really more focused on motivation than reward. So you don't feel dopamine when you get something tasty. You feel dopamine when you want something tasty, right? And then once you eat chocolate or whatever it is, you get serotonin and all kinds of other chemicals that are going on. But dopamine is the motivator that's in behind it. So every time you feel like you want to do something, that's usually a dopamine hit. So TikTok is fantastic because the dopamine hit happens as you scroll. So when you see a video you like, or even if you see a video you don't like, you're motivated to go past it, right? So this is really interesting because this platform is not new. This has been happening since the 1990s and before, honestly. This is basically a truncated version of channel surfing. We used to do this in the 90s all the time. We just like click channels, right? We just like go past next channel, next channel, next channel on the TV is what we used to do until we hit infomercials, and then we stopped channel surfing because it's 2 a.m. and we got tired and we're just like, whatever, we're just going to watch infomercials. TikTok has taken channel surfing and put it on a phone. So now we are just constantly channel surfing on this particular platform, which is fantastic for the advertisers because it keeps people on the platform. Very difficult to get off of that one. Anybody that's been on TikTok knows that it's hard to get off of that platform.
Very addicting.
It could take hours. Facebook is very different. That platform is used specifically to research information about the people that you love or people that you know. So you're scrolling basically to check for updates on a particular person, usually. You're checking for aunts, uncles, cousins, sisters, daughters, ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, ex-husbands. Like, you're on that app to double check to see what other people are doing in their life and compare it to your own. So because of like the psychology behind these two, I would say I would probably advertise to that older boomer 45. She lives with her husband, 2 cats. You know, she has kids out of her home on Facebook, not on TikTok. Now that seems like, oh, it's a no-brainer. Well, duh. Like Facebook would probably be better. But now we have to decide what should we send her, right? What messaging should we actually include in that? And that comes down to researching how she makes decisions. So that goes into a totally other like psychology-based topic, which we could also go into if you really want me to. But that comes down to understanding emotional motivations of people. And that takes a lot more research. It's not doable for people. It's just very time consuming. It takes a lot of digging into what happened to this person in their life and understanding what associations have they already made in their brain and how does that affect how they purchase things now that they're older. So a lot goes into it. I feel bad if I scared people. Sorry if I scared you people.
I think the most interesting topic would be the research part where you mentioned about it does take a lot of time to understand the consumer. And then there are so many ways to it. I just want to touch on that is like for you personally, when you are doing research work for the client, what's your sort of step-by-step process when it comes to research? Do you go on Reddit or do you go to Facebook or do you just interview customers? How does it really work? And does it really differ if brand has no experience, like a new brand and an old brand? How does it really work?
Yeah. So we have a couple different ways that we can do this. We like to do consumer behavior research twofold. The first half of it is basically just getting to know the actual brand itself. So we go through and do a full audit of the brand just to see what messaging are you already putting out there. Because depending on the message you put out, you're going to bring a very specific person back in. So after we do an audit of the brand, then we'll go through and analyze the actual person that they want to be bringing in. And this does go into lots of research on Reddit, on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, as many places as we can go, all the way down to researching a ton of things on Google, just to see what questions are people asking around this particular subject, right? Because it changes. Consumers change about every 12-ish weeks, depending on the seasons. They will also change depending on region. So somebody who's shopping in Louisiana doesn't shop the same as somebody who's shopping in like Minnesota, just based upon like weather and like family orientation, those type of things. So we have to know these things as we go forward. But the one that we lean on the most after we do all of the actual like built on online research, then we'll do something called natural language processing. It's basically taking language down from comments and reviews from the brand itself and analyzing that language to figure out which emotional motivators are coming out of the people who already purchased. So on our side at the agency, we have 9 different categories that we go through, and we actually categorize every single one of these into. And then we'll pull up frequencies of like which of these 9 categories are coming up the most. And then we can usually tell, okay, these people are shopping in this particular state or this particular state, yada, yada. From there, I can build messaging that's specific to that one emotion. And that is the reason why we've been able to consistently over and over, we've been dropping CPA by 40 to 50% across the board, just because our messaging is incredibly targeted to an emotion we know works when people purchase from this specific brand. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's interesting. So you would take like the search query results on Google and also taking on Facebook, basically all the social media platform user comments that is related to your ideal target demographic. You run it through an AI that essentially breaks down the words they use and categorize it based on the 9 categories of emotions. And from there, you try to identify the frequency and pinpoint with a relevant messaging that calls out that specific most frequent emotion.
Yeah,
so
you got it. Yeah.
For that case, for me personally, I use Satigit and Hemingway. Is there any tools that you say that is free for people to check it out? Like if they want to understand their customers, like what sort of tools would you recommend for people to use?
Yes. So this is really interesting. We just started using ChatGPT for this because originally we had to do all of this by hand. So we'd take down hundreds of thousands of comments and go through as many as we could. Usually on average, we get somewhere between like 1,500 and 2,000, but it would take us hours because we'd have to go through and categorize every single one by hand. Luckily, there's 3 people in my agency, so like we'd split it up and just do it in front of the TV and just like categorize as we go. Now I can throw it into chat and get it done in like 30 seconds.
Like, wow, like how does it go with ChatGPT though? Like I thought you just post up comment, like paste it up and then they'll just analyze it, or how does it really work?
So with chat, you have to ask it specific questions on what to categorize first. So you have to give it a range of like, of these 9 categories, which one do you see coming up most frequently in this set of comments is the question we asked it. And then just like, boom, straight down, it categorized all of them in and it said, we get 1, 2, and 5 coming up. And it was like, it like blew my mind. I was just like looking at it before this call and I'm like, oh my God, this is taking off hours of work for us. But okay, this is the caveat. I don't know if it's entirely accurate because I've only been checking it with like 3 or 4 data sets. I need to check it with a lot more to make sure that it's coming back with the correct emotions that we're identifying. But it's kind of big, kind of a big deal. I was like, cool, this saves me from actually having to hire a developer to do this for me.
I think you definitely do a tutorial about this. I think it's very interesting. Me personally, I started to play around with ChatGPT and I asked it to write UGC scripts or TikTok scripts. And it's actually not bad. It's not as bad as I thought. Like it's quite standard. I'm like, oh wow. It's really
their UGC isn't bad, honestly. And I think ChatGPT is really interesting too because it scours the entire internet, which is way better than what I could do, clearly, because there's only one of me. So it's just gathering way more information on what's current as well. So it takes a lot of brain load off for us having to generate good scripts or go through the NLP, those type of things. So yeah, that's one that we're kind of currently looking at using. There's a ton of other ones, obviously, that you can use to assist. I haven't found any that are like usable to the point where I don't have to tweak it afterwards. So yeah, we're getting there. Slowly.
Quite curious though, like for the 9 categories of emotion, what are they really like? Isn't it just happy, sad, angry? That's what I can think of. Like, what are the other things? Like, what's the difference?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting too because I need to I'll pull this up for you later. But there's a wheel that we use on the psychology side. That's basically emotion wheel. So it starts out with this happy, mad, sad, elated, fearful, those type of things. Those are base emotions. But once you move outside of that, there's just hundreds of thousands of emotions that we go through on a daily basis that sometimes can be paired similarly. So sometimes you can feel happy and scared at the same time, right? So happy and scared would be nervous, right? We have a different term for these particular ones that go together. So this wheel is really, really nice because it shows you all of the different emotions that you could possibly have outside of just sad, mad, happy. So this is really nice for anybody that wants to just understand how to build better ads from just a language standpoint. But overall, on our side, we turn these 9 different ones basically from a whole bunch of different psychology-based models. So this goes into like Maslow's law and a couple other ones that are kind of the basics of how humans feel. Yeah, hierarchy. Yes, exactly. So we start with acceptance and belonging, esteem, nurturance, freedom and autonomy, competence, I think is number 5, and then safety or security, accomplishment, which is more like achievement, like going after goals and things, empowerment, and experience is the last one. So these 9 different ones, like I said, were based on a couple different things. One of the best books I've ever read, though, like on any sort of psychology-based marketing, is Marketing to Mind States. So this model is kind of similar to the one that Will has. Will Leach, really, really good guy. I've met him a couple times. He's fantastic, really good mentor. But his model is similar to mine, but he applies it very differently. So I've tweaked mine just a tiny bit to apply to paid advertising and not necessarily marketing as a whole. So yeah.
Right. So would you use the emotions then, like just apply and write messages? Or would you pass it out to copywriters to write it, or would you write it yourself? Like just a sample for them to check it out.
So usually on the agency side, we do a 6-week sprint. So we start with the audit that we talked about before. Then we'll go through and do the actual research side, which is the NLP, categorizing all these different things. Then we'll go into the strategy itself. So once we do that, we usually provide our agency clients with 10 ads, all statics, mostly because statics are cheap to run. I don't want to produce any sort of video until I have proved the point that this one works as a static. And that's because statics are quick for messaging. So usually when we actually go through and train different things in the ad account itself, I start with any sort of static. Then I will move towards any sort of like GIF or movements, small movements, because they're also quick to produce. Then we go into UGC because I can have somebody else do that for me. And then we'll go into pro produce video with a fully validated concept of like, we know this works because we've tested it several times on several different points of media. So.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, because I see some marketers, they just go all in UGC from the start. But for you take something to test at a very cheap level first. Like perhaps for you, you would test like different static images, the same thing, but for different emotions. What triggers the most? Yeah. And then you move on to GIFs, and then move on to UGCs, and you sort of use UGC as a validation of your concept. Mm-hmm. And if it works, then full on pro production.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And we do that just because I want to test all of our ideas, especially on the emotional side, as cheaply as possible. We're trying to get as many sales for the lowest cost. That's all we're trying to do on the paid side. So if we find one static is just like popping off, like it's just going so well, then I'll take it and iterate that one into a GIF or into, whatever the next round is. The interesting part is that I've found that almost nobody has a framework for how you test in an ad account. Oftentimes it's like, we're just going to throw out whatever sounds good and like hope that our media buyer is iterating correctly. I disagree with that style just because you're burning money. You're just burning money left and right. And if you can start with the emotions and then build in angles, like layer things on top of it, way better and way cheaper overall.
Right. And how would you say like angles differ compared to emotions then for this case?
Yeah.
Would you say angle first and then you use the relevant emotions to drive and communicate the angle? How does it really work for your case?
Yeah. So we always test emotions first. So if we find out of the 9 categories, a particular brand's customer really feels like they want to nurture their family as a part of the reason why they purchased, then we'll pick nurturance as what we're going after. So that's the emotion we're starting with. So we'll build ads that say phrases such as like, do this together, or like we're in it together. Those type of messages. Togetherness is really, really important. And then we'll choose images of families, or like a mom and a daughter, or a brother to brother. We'll choose images that match that like togetherness message. Once we do that, then we will iterate off of one that's working into angles. So the angles itself is like, maybe this is like a keto product and we're going to go after moms who are really wanting to nurturing their families, right? So we'll build messaging around like, are you a mom that's just starting keto? Here's the steps that you need to take. Like our product is fantastic, whatever it is, right? So we'll layer on top of the emotional motivator all these different angles of testing, moms to sons, or we'll do, family to family, or we'll do sister to sister. Then we can layer in the angles on top of it, which makes it way easier for us to understand which one of these angles are hitting the best instead of just like, we're going to run all the angles.
Yes.
And hope
Yeah,
this
that's
one hits.
something I found guilty as well. I just throw everything and see, I hope it sticks.
Yes, and hope it sticks. I have to know which emotion they're going after first. And then I want to know which angle is going to hit the best. Because man, I mean, this kind of system makes it so that you'll never run out of things to test, which is something we're seeing across the board. People are like fatiguing. Creative
Yeah.
energy is really difficult to produce in the brain. It takes a lot of glucose. You get really tired as a creator because it's so much brain work. So what we're trying to produce is a framework so that it makes it easier for us to never run out of things to test. If I find that like keto moms who really want to nurture their families is hitting, then I'm going to build out 10 different creatives that talk all about how difficult keto is, how easy our product makes it so that you can still have fun with your family. You can still have, meals with them. Like we're going to talk about all of the features and benefits that we always talk about. We're just hitting it first with the emotion and the angle that we know works.
Right. And normally for your agency side would be emotional first. And then if the emotional kind of works with a static image, for example, and then you start to move on with angles instead, build around the angle, let's say the mom, and then you pair up with, again, the different combination of creatives, and then you repeat it at scale. I think it's very interesting because for me personally, the way we do it is we use angles right away. And we didn't really think about the emotional side. We do understand that we need to incorporate some sort of emotions, but we normally let the creators themselves decide the tone of emotions.
Yeah.
So that seems to be very interesting when it comes to that. More control, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. And you'll notice too that one creator usually does better than another. You'll have one creator that's just like, man, they're good. Every time we throw it in the account, it does really well, and we can't figure out why. It's usually because that creator hits the direct emotion the best, like tonally, but also facially. Like they will hit on frustration really well, or they'll hit on love really well, or they'll hit on like emotions that fit with that particular customer's psychographic profile. So if you find a creator that's doing it well, figure out which emotion they're showing and they're displaying in their voice really well, and move towards that emotion. And you'll usually, if you look at it well enough, you don't even need the 9 emotions that like the categories that we have. Usually you can tell. It's like that. They're just really good at like showing frustration. Or like they're just really good at showing sadness. Like you can figure it out pretty quickly. But if you notice it working well, keep doing it.
That is true. Yeah, I'm wondering for your case, when it comes to testing like the different emotions, for example, like you mentioned that you have one you want to test. Would you test like multiple emotions at once, or just one emotion with different creatives, and then if it doesn't work, then you move on to other emotions?
Yeah.
Like, how does
so usually when we do the NLP report, we'll get frequencies, like I said. So we'll pull up like this particular brand set has a customer that has these top emotions, right? 1, 2, and 3. So we'll always test whichever one's coming up most frequently first. But I do like to test at least 2 or 3 emotions in the account at a time, because depending on the time of year, we might hit a different emotion better. It's my brain is weird.
How does it really impact it? Like from your case, like especially with countries with different seasons, like winter, summer, how does emotions come into play for this? Like, because if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong. In winter, most of the time, people will feel less happier compared to summer because of the psychological
depression.
So how does it really differ when it comes to this? Like, how would you guys take into account and say, okay, we should test these emotions first? Like, how does it really work for this?
This is really interesting because this goes into studying like macroeconomics, which is really interesting too. So not just economics, but also like consumer behavior and across the board, depending on the country that you're in. Obviously, I'm in the US, so I know the US market really, really well. And in the US right now, really based upon like the consumer index itself, and this is like the emotional index that we're using to track how people feel about the year. People aren't super satisfied with where the country is right now. Partially just because of like the political stance that we're in, but also because of really just the economic standpoint that we're in. We keep hearing the word recession in America, so that freaks people out. Consumers get really scared. They start to like hoard their money a little bit, right? But we also saw that this was one of the best Black Fridays we've ever had across the board. There was like $9.4 billion spent in the US alone. So yeah, I mean, money was spent. So we have to take this into account that things that are in the environment are always going to affect the people that live in that environment. So you have to take into account which country you're in, who you're trying to go after, and understand what's happening in that particular country, what's happening in this time period of the year. A summer buyer is very different than a winter buyer, depending on who they are and what products they're looking for. So, for instance, as a mom, I don't look for any sort of like clothes for my kids for the entire year until we hit about like July. So in July, I'll start looking for kids' clothes because we have to start shopping for back to school, which happens in August. So I'm like somewhere in June, July, August, I'm starting to think about purchasing, right? Spending money. But that the rest of the year, I'm not thinking about it at all. I don't ever buy clothes for my kids for the rest of the year. So if you're selling kids' clothes, your biggest time of the year is not necessarily Black Friday. It's July and August.
I think same goes for the nutrients and supplements as well.
Yeah,
I heard Nick Sharma podcast and chat about like, well, for supplements, normally the best time of the year, it's New Year resolution.
Yes, New Year's, exactly. Anybody in the health space understands that your biggest time of the year is not Black Friday. It's January 1st, like the entire month of January. If you're in the Nutri space, that's exactly what you're trying to get towards. So, and this is for every industry across the board. If you're in the pet space, if you're in the watch space, like wherever you are, your consumers are going to change, like I said, about every 12 weeks, because that's about how long the seasons last. Even if you're in a space that doesn't have like weather seasons, you still have purchasing seasons. So we have to take all of this into an account. And that's the reason why like it's difficult to hire creative strategists sometimes, because this should be taken into account. And not every creative strategist does this. Some of them do, some of them don't. So it just depends.
Right. And it's very interesting as well to see like when it comes to the different ways of testing, like for you yourself, a bit of media buying, because I'm a big fan of media buyer. So when it comes to testing, for me, I'm a big fan of the DCT, like dynamic creative, like chuck it all. I don't think about it. Are you on that camp, or are you the Asraf ISO camp with lots of crazy ad sets and targeting and all that? What's your goal for that?
I actually really like the dynamic creative testing just because I don't believe that there's any human that can do what the algorithm can do for itself. We have a lot of control over what the creative looks like, but we have almost no control over where it goes. Like we can tell the system, send it here, but it's just going to put it wherever it thinks somebody's going to purchase, right? Or somebody's going to send traffic or whatever. Exactly. So I'm not going to waste money if I don't have to. I like the DCT style, only if you're hitting on really good emotions and really good angles. Like you have to know what you're doing creatively. But if you do, you can get some really good results from that. So yeah.
Right, yeah, that's true. I've asked a couple of marketers, a lot of people seem to leaning towards the DCT method as well. Like it just takes so much time off from playing around and clicking buttons, and really starts to really sit down and really strategize about what consumers really want and what do they really desire, rather than just pushing and stuffing it in their face of what they really want.
Exactly.
And I've also seen you talking about like the 3 elements when it comes to, let's say, looking at comments. You mentioned like life events, emotional motivators, and higher order goals. Would you be able to sprinkle on that? Like just explain to the audience, how do you use that to analyze comments?
Yeah. So this is kind of in tandem with the categories that we use to get the emotion like frequencies come out. But when we're looking at this, I also look at like secondary markers for things, just because I want to create an entire picture of who this person is, not just like one piece at a time. One emotion is fantastic, but understanding the entire person is way better. So if you can do this, I would suggest that you try and find these things out through an interview. I always think that you should have like actual full-on conversation with the customer, because once you start getting someone to talk, you can find out some really weird things about them. How their voice does in fluctuations, what their facial expressions look like. It's very important for understanding the full story of what they went through to get to purchasing. But overall, we like to look at things like triggering events. So this has to do with what actually motivated you to buy, not emotionally, but what was the life event. So did you just buy a house? Did you decide to go keto? Are you trying to adopt a child? Are you looking for new shoes? Like, what was it that forced you into this decision? Because that will help us understand why and what helped you kind of jump the fence over to purchase, right? The other one that we're kind of looking at, obviously, is those emotional motivators. So those 9 different categories. And then on top of that, I have 2 other ones. So higher order goals has to do with like, are you a pessimistic person, or are you like an optimistic person when it comes to like life purchases? And I would like to caveat this. You may think you're pessimistic or optimistic when it comes to life, but your like level of those things will change depending on what you're purchasing. So purchasing a car may be pessimistic for you, but purchasing a cat may be optimistic for you. It just depends on like what it is and what your associations are. It's very possible that like all through your childhood, your parents constantly had car issues. So every time they purchased a car, it was like a stressful situation. So now
It
you
is,
as
yeah.
an adult take that into your purchasing decision and now you just hate purchasing cars. That's what happened to me. So like I hate purchasing cars. I hate it so much. My husband loves it. His parents got a new car like all the time. It was never a big deal. Like this was just a part of his childhood was getting new cars and it was fun and they went and bought one, right? Totally different purchasing motivations and very different ways of looking at it, but it still comes into play. So and every purchase is going to be different. So on top of those three things, we also look at anybody who influenced the purchase. So I want to know, was your mom with you? Was your coworker with you? Was your dad with? Who was in the room when you purchased? Because that changes a lot about how much you purchase, how much you spend. I mean, it's just bonkers. If I'm shopping with my kids, I want to get out of that store in 10 minutes because these kids are bonkers, right? If I'm shopping with myself, I will spend 2 hours just like looking at stuff.
Just window shopping around.
Yes, exactly. Just like looking around at whatever's in the room. So again, not all of this has to be done. This seems like a lot, and it's just because Sarah's weird and I just like to analyze this much stuff. But it's helpful. It's so helpful to know because I can reference that in an ad every time.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about it is when it comes to, let's say, shopping men's clothes. If I'm not mistaken, I remember some brands, they purposely target the females because they know that the females
100%.
decide what the men's going to wear. Because men is like not bothered to pick and choose different outfits, and women are usually the one that decides the purchase. Yeah, I think that same goes for kids, like events as well. Like normally parents are the one that decides because kids are consumer, but the customers are the parents. Yes, I think is that how would you approach the situation as well?
Yeah. So the best example of this is probably Home Depot. So Home Depot's ads, if you see them on the commercials on TV, they will always show some guy in like a tool belt with his buckets and like all of his things that he's doing, right? But that's just the first part of the ad. It's just to catch your attention of like, here's a guy who knows what he's doing, who's going to go build something. The second half of the ad is always the wife or the kids, right? They're showing family almost always. Somebody walking through the store, somebody like buying things, but then they'll switch straight back to, here's the pergola you built her. Here's the fence that you built her. Here's the patio you built her. It has more to do with who he's building for than just like a guy building stuff. If they ran an ad with a guy just building stuff, I don't think they would have nearly as a success with their TV ads. So this comes into play in paid advertising as well, especially for D2C. Like, very important to understand who's consuming it and who's buying it. Because you can market to the buyer all day long, but that person has no reason to buy it unless they're purchasing it for someone that they want to nurture.
Is there any sample clients you could think of that you use this scenario to sign out your creatives?
Yes. Okay. So the best one that we had, there was a group that basically made like it was like a lettuce tower, right? So you've seen these, they're like hydroponic towers that you can grow lettuce out of and like, in your house, right? So they came to me mostly because they were struggling with acquisition. It was really difficult to get anybody to purchase on the top of the funnel or anywhere in the funnel, really. So they were trying to figure out, how do we market this to people? We really want it to be like a luxury product. We're trying really hard to focus this in on, this is something like a conversation piece in your house. You can talk to people about it. It's very beautiful, like those types of things. So I went in and I did the full research of NLP report, and we did all of this interesting work of trying to figure out who's influencing, what are their triggering events, those type of things. And I came back and I said, I hate to break it to you, really sorry, but none of your customers purchased this because it was an art piece. Like almost all of them purchased this because they're talking about it as if it's a pet. Lots of language around pet usage. Yeah. So the comments that were coming in were things like, our children are learning responsibility. We love taking care of it every day. I check it every morning. It was just like pet kept coming out. All these languages about pet. It was fascinating. Okay. So we went down and we broke it down, all of this language, into this pet-based language for the new messaging. And we found that these people wanted to nurture their families. That was a big part of it. They categorized down into nurturance. And as soon as we ran the new ads, we found one particular copywriting headline that hit super well. And it was very simple. It just said, grow together, right? That was it. 2 words, grow together. and then it had an image of a daughter and a mom next to the product, and that was it. And this ad increased their ROAS by like 94%, and that was within the first like week. It was just like straight up. I was like,
damn.
Again,
I
was like, all right, cool. So at least we know we're onto something. So we iterated more and more and more of these, like grow together, grow together, grow together. And no matter what, as long as we paired it with some sort of an adult and a child, it did really, really well.
Right.
And this is why the psychology is super important, because you can throw anything you want out there all day long. But if you don't understand why they're purchasing and who they're purchasing for, we're just burning money, basically.
Right, right. That's true.
That one was a fun one. I like that one.
Well, speaking of which, like when it comes to crafting the audience, like for me, when I talk to some media buyers, they have a really big, they're a big believer of saying that you shouldn't do that creative, you should do it in a copy where you can write like a long story that really speaks out to, let's say, grow together, like for your case, the mom and the kid together. What's your stance on like copy, using that as a part of copy for paid ads? Like, would you use that sort of long form copy, or would you transfer it into the creative instead? What's your stance on this?
I have noticed, and this is just anecdotally, we'd have to do some studies on this, but I have noticed that the more complicated your product, the more description copy you should have. If you have something that's really simple, like I'm selling oranges, as simple as you can possibly get it. You just say something funny, one sentence, a couple emojis, call it good. But if you have something that's like a full-on course for understanding like quantum physics, you better explain what the heck is going on. Mostly because you're targeting two separate different people. Again, we got to look at the psychology of it. Who is going after something that would require a big, lengthy, long description? Usually someone who's highly educated, who needs some sort of educational product, who expects these ads to come through with some sort of like proof that this is what they're going to be able to accomplish. So simple products, simple headlines,
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily like discredit to say, oh, nah, it doesn't work. It's more on how complicated the nature of the product is. And again, the psychology behind it, like who is really buying. Because I was thinking, like, let's say for cases of, let's say, buying flowers online, and I do see some cases where some media buyers, where they write like a long story of like, oh, you try to get your date and you impress the date with this flower. Doesn't seem to really work. So, but instead, you just slap it with flowers for your love of your life, free shipping. Boom. And then it just works. And then I was like, oh, I've been told that copy works 100%, like having a story, but I am surprised by how simple it can be compared to that.
It's really interesting too, because I think simplistic copy works better in the scroll age, because people aren't really, I don't know, they're just not looking to read. That sounds terrible, but like we don't want to read stuff. It's just too long. Give me the synopsis. I want the highlights, like Spark Note it. I want you to truncate it down so I don't have to consume so much. Because the more decisions the brain has to make during the day, the more it gets fatigued, the harder it is to make decisions as you go along. And eventually you just stop making decisions entirely. Usually about 9 p.m., I'm like donuts all day. I don't even care. Like I'm so tired. So the same happens online. Exactly. The same happens online, where again, if it's a very complex product, I want to learn more about it. I want you to tell me the story. But if it's something super simple like shoes or keychains or whatever it is, just make it quick and easy for me to understand why I should click on this. Doesn't need to be exciting. Just give me the like summary of it.
Synopsis, right? That's true.
Synopsis.
Yeah, because I do see some media buyers, they like, because they were so into copy, they just think they have to do a long copy for every single thing. Like, and then I was like, but as a consumer, like sometimes, but perhaps would you say it depends on the generation again? Like, for example, boomers, or let's say older generation, they prefer to read a longer copy because they like to read newspapers. But for Gen Zs, we like TikTok. So if you were to target that audience, it wouldn't really necessarily work, even though it's complicated, because we want synopsis. But boomers, they want, like, they enjoy reading the description because it reminds them of a newspaper. Would you say that? Would you say so like that?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because we have to take into account education levels. Anybody who's 22, is just getting out of high school, going into college, especially in the US. So they have not had higher level education yet. So they're not to the point where they want to consume a lot of text-based stuff, right? So they're used to learning through video. Whereas the boomers, that's all they ever did. Like reading was a huge part of their life and still is. They're also to the age where a lot of them probably have bachelor's, master's, PhDs. Like they're used to that style of learning where it's very like,
Yeah.
literary. It depends again. And this is the reason why I can always come up here and be like, yes, this is the definitive way you should do it. Test though. Test. We still need good media buyers. We still need people who understand the platforms. Because again, sometimes I'm surprised. Sometimes we send out a huge crap ton of text and it just crushes for like robes
Wow.
or, glasses or whatever it is. And again, it depends on the time of year. It depends on what people are doing and what they're interested in. And sometimes it does really, really well. So we always iterate off of what's working. Test. Always test for sure.
Right. I would just say like your agency, like since people have mentioned that another thing would be the offer as well, like offer and creative, like it's a good combination that always people love to use. Like how would you like say at like using psychology to price the right offer? Like what is your stance on this? How do you guys really do it from your end?
Yeah. So we haven't done like a ton of offer generation, mostly because we're on the paid side. And so the offer's usually done by the time we get to where we're going.
Oh, true.
But I would say pricing psychology is fascinating. Like the things that you can do with just changing numbers around is bonkers. Like it's just nuts. In general, the number 9 is very like enticing to people, especially because if it's at the end of a number. So 9 is one of those numbers that it signifies less than 10, so it must be a good deal type of a thing. So this is why anytime you see like any sort of like courses, you'll always see 449, 479, 499. It will always end in a 9 because psychologically the brain says it's less than 500, so it must be a good deal, right? Very interesting things. They've also done studies on the fact that males in particular are very sensitive to the color red. So if you have a price that's in the color red, it doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. Oftentimes you can see good lift if you have a male dominated crowd and you're selling to anybody in that demographic. If you change your pricing colors to red, you'll actually increase sales, which is like weird.
Is that any for females and
yeah, well, I kept reading on to see if they had any studies on females and colors, but I haven't found any yet, which is super random. But yeah, lots of different things like that where it's like so random, but everything affects you.
Yeah, and I found out that like personal testing, like compared to a whole number and let's say a decimal number, like for example, like instead of 100, I put like 95 or 99.
Yeah,
worked really well. Like people were so obsessed with the 99 and the 100. And I was like, why?
Well, this comes down to landing pages too. Like if you have a sequence of numbers where you're going up an offer, where it's like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, always make sure that you flip it. Put the highest price one first and then go down and lower and have that be the one that's selected. Mostly because people will understand that there's different tier offers, but the one that's pre-selected usually gets chosen first, no matter what. So it's there's so many weird little like tactics and tricks that you can use. Yeah, very much price anchoring.
Anchor the price, and as they compare the scroll down, it gets cheaper and cheaper. They say, oh, why not just it's a good deal. It just slaps on it.
100%. So really, this comes down to perception or value perception more than anything else, and anchoring. What are your prices anchored off of? Random study that they did a long time ago, where they had someone move from like Chicago to New York and check to see whether their price anchoring changed. And that particular person carried the prices of Chicago to New York and they had it for about like 3 years. So that particular consumer thought that like the price of gas in New York was ridiculously high because their price anchor was in Chicago. It wasn't in New York. I'm like, that's scary. This is like driving me crazy. So I'm like, the price of candy bars, the price of shoes, like everything is affected by what you have already stored in your brain. It's very intense. Scares me sometimes. But it's fascinating stuff, though.
I think I read a story by your friend Barry Holt. I think he did a study on like the one that you shared, the fruits example. I think that's really interesting. Like the ugly fruit and like the imperfect fruit, like what?
Yes.
People were willing to buy it.
Yes. And this all comes down to how humans understand the world around you. Like we have to create a hierarchy somehow. Usually it's visual, but sometimes it's also just built upon labels and the labels we use for each other, the labels used for things in your environment. So again, I used this example with somebody recently where you can term someone a friend or you can term someone as an acquaintance. They're still the same person. That person never changed. The only thing that changed was your label for them. But it makes a very big difference when you introduce them to somebody else saying, this is my friend, or like, this is my acquaintance. Very different too if you introduce someone as like, this is my friend, or this is my girlfriend. This is my friend, this is my boyfriend, right? Totally different connotation. The only thing that changed was the label. The human never changed.
Right.
Labels
That's true.
are
Maybe that's why you have
crazy.
sense of psychology behind, because humans they never do. It's just the tips and tricks. That's what like variable. That's what makes it fun. But the boring part is humans are pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, humans are the same thing across the board. Very interesting stuff, and it alters depending on culture and where you live. But yeah, the psychology is fascinating. That's why I'm so into it.
And quite curious, though, since you've mentioned that you create like strategies for UGC creators, copywriters, media buyers, what sort of approach would you do? Would you, according to Motion, like they did like a sort of paper for people who want to know what a creative strategist is like? They have sort of two approach, a brick by brick, or a sweet spot approach where it's more towards whether you give more freedom or less. Which side of the camp are you on? Would you prefer to really give more like restrictions, like to let them know what they want, like that, or they have to shoot for, like, or would you give them the freedom to do so?
I think I'd probably want to go a little bit more on the structured side, because I find that some people have a difficult time understanding how to build. And we talked about this before, where implementation is difficult. It's really hard for people to take all of the stuff that we just talked about and put it into an ad. So I would so much rather give structure first and then have you iterate after, because iterations seem to be a little bit easier. So, yeah.
Right. So it's more like a storyboarding approach.
Yeah.
Like, would you do it on a Google slide and just like screenshots to say, okay, this is like the sample I want, and then these are the emotions you can try on, and these are the words you can say.
Yeah. So usually we build briefs. So I'll give them the actual copy of like, this is what I want of the ad. This is the inspiration ad. Usually we use foreplay, so we pull it in and just give them an example of what we want to see. Sometimes though, they do have copywriters and graphic designers on board. And if they have those people on board, then I'll usually work with the copywriter and just say, okay, we're going to go after the emotion of like esteem this month. So we want our customers to feel like they're going to look really cool if they buy this product. So I want you to come up with like 10 or 15 headlines that speak directly towards building esteem, and then see what they come back with. Yeah.
Right. That's interesting. But when it comes to, let's say, like after you've implemented it, and when it comes to tracking the result, what are the creative metrics that you will use to evaluate your performance? You kind of touch on a bit of ROAS, a bit of here and there.
Yeah.
Like, what are the lists would you actually look at for your case?
Yeah. So every brand is different. Some of the brands that we have are still kind of working off of older, what I would call older metrics. And that's specifically just by design. Like their teams like to look at very specific things. But overall, I would say CPA in general. That's probably the first place I go, is how cheap are we getting people in the door? If our CPAs are over our benchmark, then we got a problem. Like we need to start looking at why this ad is not hitting psychologically well and change it from there. After CPAs, I always like to look at click-through rate just to see how many people are actually coming through this ad. Are we getting people to stop and actually move away from the platform, or are they just sitting and not doing anything with this ad? When it comes to video, we're looking specifically at hold rate over hook rate. Hook rate is always secondary for me. I like hook rate just because it tells me whether or not we have an interesting start to our ad, but it does nothing for us if people don't stay. So I like to look at hold rate before hook rate. And then after that, obviously, like click-through rates on that side as well. We're trying to get conversions though. So overall, how many of conversions are we getting? Like, what are the sales? Give me the ROAS, because I need to understand, are we making any progress overall?
Right. And for those audience that are not sure with the term of hook rate and hold rate is basically the amount of people that got caught on and spent 3 seconds of their time watching a video, and hold rate is 3 seconds after or more, or to the completion of the video where they will finish watching it. So that is the two metrics that you will see popping up very often with creative strategists, and hope that clears up. Because when I first joined the creative strategists like chat and like just following you guys, I'm so confused. Like,
I know, there's so many terms.
Yeah.
It took me a while to learn them too. I was like, what are you talking about? What's the click-through rate? It also took me a while to understand all of the acronyms because they're so close. It's like CTR, CPC, CPA, CPM. I was like, what is
so many
that?
C's, man.
Yeah, there were so many. It took me forever. Yeah, I got you on that one.
Right. So when it comes to priority, would you say things like, for example, the CPA, since you are very conversion focused for the clients, and then conversions, and then would be things such as the hook rate, the hold rate, and then the hook rate, and then finally the click-through rate itself.
Yep.
Would you say that's the order that you would look at?
Yeah, usually. Yep.
Right.
And unless they want us to look at something else, sometimes the brands have a specific metric we want to track, but most of the time not.
Right.
So
would you guys do like the approach? So I heard some media buyers, they use like video views to kind of test it out first, test the video, and then with a small budget, and after that they pivot to full on conversion. Would you guys do that, or would you guys just do straight on full conversion? Like, don't want to train the algorithm for the wrong way?
I don't necessarily believe we train the algorithm to do anything. Like, people have this weird misconception of like, you can train the algorithm by doing video views first and then moving into a conversion campaign. And I'm like, I don't think that we're tricking the algorithm into doing literally anything. I think if your ad's going to perform well on like video views, it'll probably perform well on conversion at the same time. Also, I'm not going to waste money trying to like do two different tests. You know, I want to test in a conversion sense. Like, if the conversions don't work, the conversions didn't work. There's no reason to get video views first and then try and get conversions, because we're just spending money in two different spots. So
and like, just wasting money for your perspective anyway.
Yeah. I'm very frugal person. I hate spending money, so I'm like, anytime we can save money, it's best.
No more traffic, no more videos that we throw that out.
Exactly. Just get me conversion. Just get me the conversion. Exactly.
Right. Is there any sort of trends do you notice when it comes to like the most common emotions that works really well, like in general, like across all your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I would say security comes up a lot in the United States. Security is one that has to do mostly with like achieving goals, but also guaranteeing your success with like a little bit of risk management, if that makes sense. So when we talk about security, I'm talking most about people really want to make sure that they can achieve their goals without actually having to feel any pain to do that. And that's pretty common. So I see security come up a lot. I also see nurturance in the United States as well. There's a lot that goes around that, especially when it comes to like any sort of family product. People in the Americas seem to be very family focused. So they tend to skew towards nurturance in particular. Outside of that, though, I'd have to study some other countries just to see if the other countries have the same or similar kind of things coming up. But it just depends on what the product is.
Right. That's true. Yeah. I'm wondering for your case, like after coming through a long way as a creative strategist, what would be the number one advice would you give to someone that's completely new, a rookie that's looking to just do performance creatives? Yeah.
If you're into performance creative, I would do a couple things. One, I would start following anyone on Twitter who has a good background in performance creative. And if you don't know who that is, usually you can go to either my profile or, you know, any of like the bigger names, Barry Hott or Nick Shackelford, any of those guys, and check to see who they follow. And then I would go and look and see what they're actually tweeting. Just check and see, like, are they like tweeting a lot about this particular concept? And then follow those people and just start reading content. That's kind of where I started, was just I need to figure out what language are they using, what like acronyms are they talking about, and get an understanding of what paid advertising is, how it works, that type of thing. That's going to be an integral piece to create any sort of creative strategy. You have to understand how the paid advertising side works. After that, then I would go through, and I've suggested this to a few people, and people get nervous when I do this, but I would actually start to design some ads. Even if you are not a good designer, that's totally fine. Even if you have no experience in it, everyone who is a creative strategist needs to design an ad. Mostly because you need to understand what to tell the graphic designers, the copywriters, the media buyers. You have to know what to tell them to produce. And the only way you can do that is by knowing what you've produced before. So if you don't have any experience in this, I would suggest go to Canva and just get a free account and just type in ads or Facebook ads, TikTok ads, Twitter ads, whatever it is. And it'll pull up like hundreds of thousands of templates and start messing with the template. Just move things around, type in your own copy, figure out a way to build a good ad, and then compare it to the ads of the brands that you like the most. So I usually follow people like Avi. They do really, really good visual ads. They're fantastic. Magic Spoon does a really, really good job. Caraway does a good job. Like, there's a couple brands that you can follow on Twitter and elsewhere, Instagram, those type of places. And then start noticing, because as soon as you start following those brands, you're going to see ads come up on Facebook. So as soon as you see a good ad, look at it and compare it to the one you designed and start matching them together. And as soon as you have like a good basis of like, okay, I kind of understand a little bit about the design and a little bit about paid advertising, then you can start connecting with other people in the industry. So myself, or like we said, Very Hot, those type of people, and start taking a conversation and just get more education. That's going to be really important for your career.
Exactly. And don't worry, marketing is a very friendly world. Everybody's friendly to each other. Like I just DM Sarah out of the blue, like, hey, you want to do a pod? And Sarah's like, cool. And I was like, oh, it works.
This is like one of my favorite things to do is podcasting.
Yeah, I think just like if you're really shy and don't really know what to do, well, feel free to follow a lot of these great creators and even UGC content creators as well. Like personally, I feel like the samples they shared really helps you to understand what are the formats they use, and you can use it to reverse engineer the common sort of ways to plot and apply it on your own.
Yep, 100%. Yep. Just follow people. Follow and watch. That's probably the very first thing you should do. Follow and watch what people are doing.
All right, great. Well, this marks today's episode, and see you guys next time. And hope you guys like, share, and comment, and feel free to give us any feedback. Myself, or even Sarah. So this is the end of it now, and see you next time. Goodbye. Bye bye.